The cafe smelled of fresh coffee and something sweet. Vanilla, maybe cinnamon. Daniel Carter sat near the window, stirring a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. The rain drizzled outside, painting streaks down the glass, matching the way his thoughts dragged in circles. The place was quiet, except for the low hum of conversation and the occasional hiss of steaming milk from behind the counter. He wasn't sure why he had come here. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the way home felt less like home these days. His phone vibrated against the table. Sarah. He hesitated before answering. Hey. His voice was steady, but there was no warmth to it. Hey, she echoed. In the background, the clatter of a keyboard. She was at work again. You'll be home for dinner. Daniel exhaled slowly. What time? He could hear her shifting papers. Not sure yet. Maybe order something if I'm late. It wasn't new, this routine of distance. Years ago they had laughed at the idea of becoming that couple. The ones who spoke only in logistics, who forgot what it meant to want each other. Yet here they were. All right, he said, and the call ended. A chair scraped against the floor nearby. He glanced up, expecting just another stranger, but then, Daniel. The voice pulled him back years. He turned and there she was. Emily Thompson. She hadn't changed much, except maybe for the way her eyes held something deeper now, something unreadable. Her auburn hair was tucked into a loose bun, a few strands falling free against her cheek. She was wearing a dark green coat, damp at the shoulders from the rain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she smiled, tentative but warm. Wow. I didn't expect to see you here, she said, pulling off her coat and draping it over the chair across from him. Yeah, Daniel murmured. It's been, 10 years? About that. She sat down, studying him. You look, she hesitated, then smirked. Older. He chuckled. So do you. Emily raised an eyebrow. That's not how you compliment a woman, Carter. He smirked. I'm out of practice. The joke lingered between them, but neither laughed. A silence stretched, not awkward but heavy. Daniel glanced at her left hand. A wedding band. His stomach tightened, but he wasn't sure why. So, she said, leaning back, fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Married. You. She nodded. 3 years. Daniel's gaze flickered to her hands again. She wasn't wearing an engagement ring. And, Emily prompted. Happy. The question shouldn't have felt so invasive. He almost lied. But instead, he exhaled, rolling the words around in his mouth before speaking. It's comfortable. Emily tilted her head. That's not the same thing. He gave a small shrug. Maybe it is. She didn't argue, but the knowing look in her eyes unsettled him. I get it, she said after a beat, her voice softer now. Mark, he's a good man. Steady. Kind. She hesitated. But sometimes it feels like we're just existing in the same space, you know? Daniel nodded, something inside him unraveling. Yeah, he admitted. I know. For a moment, it was just them, breathing in the weight of shared understanding. Outside, the rain thickened, tapping insistently against the window. Emily broke the silence first, her voice lighter now, almost teasing. Remember that summer at the lake house? You and Ryan tried to build a raft, and it fell apart immediately. Daniel chuckled, the memory surfacing like a forgotten melody. We almost drowned. And you stood there laughing instead of helping. He grinned. You deserved it. For the first time in a long time, something inside Daniel eased. He had forgotten how easy things used to be. How laughter felt before it became something rare. Emily glanced at the time and sighed. I should go. Mark's expecting me. Daniel nodded, though something in him resisted the thought of her leaving. She hesitated, fingers tapping against the table. Listen, it was really nice seeing you. Maybe we could catch up again sometime. The words were casual, but the way she said them wasn't. Daniel hesitated. He should say no. He should smile and let her walk away. But instead he said, yeah, I'd like that. Emily smiled, and for a moment, the space between them felt smaller. As she left, Daniel watched her go, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air. His phone buzzed again. Sarah. This time he let it ring. The bar was dimly lit, the soft glow of hanging bulbs casting shadows across polished mahogany. A quiet hum of conversation wove through the air, punctuated by the clink of ice against glass. Daniel sat at the far end, nursing a whiskey he barely tasted. He shouldn't be here. Emily had suggested the place. Neutral, out of the way. Just catching up, she had said. But Daniel knew better. There was an unspoken weight to their meeting, something neither of them wanted to name. The door opened, a burst of cool air slipping in as Emily stepped inside. She scanned the room, eyes landing on him instantly. She smiled, and just like that, the space between them felt smaller again. "Didn't think you'd actually come," she said, sliding onto the stool beside him. Daniel smirked. "Neither did I." The bartender approached, and Emily ordered a gin and tonic. As they waited, she glanced at his glass. "Whiskey, huh? You used to hate that. Things change." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, as if measuring how much had really changed. The bartender placed her drink in front of her, and she stirred the ice absent-mindedly. "So," she said, shifting in her seat. "How's Sarah?" The question caught him off guard. He exhaled, rubbing his fingers over the rim of his glass. "She's good. Busy. Always working." Emily nodded, something knowing flickering across her expression. "Mark's the same way. Sometimes I wonder if we'd even notice if one of us just stopped trying." Daniel studied her, noting the tension in her jaw, the way she traced patterns against the condensation on her glass. "Do you still love him?" he asked before he could stop himself. Emily's fingers stilled. She didn't answer right away. "I don't know," she admitted finally, voice quiet. "I think I love who we used to be. But now, I don't know." A silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of things they weren't saying. Daniel glanced down at his wedding band, twisting it absently. "I think about that a lot," he murmured. "How things used to be with Sarah. Before schedules and silence became normal." Emily let out a soft laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You ever feel like you're just playing a role? Like you wake up and go through the motions because that's what's expected?" Daniel looked at her, then really looked at her. The flickering candlelight caught the amber in her eyes, and for a moment, he saw the girl she used to be. The one who had once dared him to jump into the lake in the middle of the night. The one who used to make him feel like anything was possible. "Yeah," he said. "I do." Emily took a slow sip of her drink, her eyes never leaving his. What if it didn't have to be that way? The question hung in the air, dangerous and unspoken in its implications. Daniel's pulse quickened. He should laugh it off. He should remind her they were married, that this was a conversation neither of them had any business having. Instead, he held her gaze and asked, "And what would that look like?" Emily inhaled sharply, as if surprised he had taken the bait. But she didn't back down. "Maybe it's just remembering who we were before we became this," she said. "Maybe it's something as simple as feeling alive again." Daniel's grip tightened around his glass. Feeling alive again. He thought about the coldness of his house, the way Sarah barely looked at him anymore. He thought about the nights spent lying awake, wondering if this was all there was. And then he thought about Emily. Emily, who had always been a spark of something reckless and untamed. Emily, who was sitting across from him now, waiting for an answer. His throat felt dry. He took another sip of whiskey, letting the burn steady him. "We shouldn't be having this conversation," he said, but even as he spoke, he knew it was already too late. Emily smiled, but there was a sadness to it. "I know." Neither of them moved. Neither of them made a decision. But something had shifted. A line had been drawn, not in words, but in the silence that followed. And deep down, Daniel knew that sooner or later, one of them would cross it. Daniel told himself it was just another evening. Another mindless drive through quiet streets. Another routine night where nothing would happen. And yet, when he pulled into the small parking lot behind Emily's bookstore, his pulse was anything but steady. The neon closed sign in the window flickered weakly, but inside, the soft glow of warm lighting stretched across shelves of forgotten stories. Emily stood near the counter, her back turned as she restocked a row of hardcovers. She hadn't heard him come in. For a moment he just watched. She moved differently than Sarah. Slower, more deliberate, as if she belonged in the quiet spaces of the world. There was something intimate about seeing her like this, lost in a task so simple, so hers. Then, as if sensing his presence, she glanced over her shoulder. "You actually came." Daniel stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "You didn't think I would." Emily smirked, setting down the book in her hands. "Oh, I thought you'd talk yourself out of it." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I almost did." A charged silence settled between them. The air felt thick, heavy with something neither of them wanted to name. Emily leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You keep showing up, Daniel." "I know." She tilted her head. "Why?" It was a simple question, but it felt like a challenge. He could lie, say it was just friendship, just coincidence. But something about the way she looked at him made it impossible to hide. "Because when I'm with you," he hesitated, searching for the right words. "It doesn't feel like I'm disappearing." Emily's lips parted slightly, as if his honesty had caught her off guard. She didn't look away. "You're not the only one who feels that way," she admitted. The space between them seemed smaller now, though neither of them had moved. Daniel swallowed. "Then what are we doing?" Emily let out a breath, soft, uncertain. "I don't know." But she did. They both did. A car passed outside, headlights flashing briefly through the window. The moment wavered, teetering on the edge of something irreversible. Daniel should leave. He should turn around, walk out the door, and never come back. Instead, he stepped forward. Emily didn't move. His fingers brushed against the counter, inches from hers. The smallest touch, but it sent a wildfire through his veins. Her breath hitched. "This is dangerous." "I know." She closed her eyes for the briefest moment, as if trying to steady herself. When she opened them again, something unspoken passed between them. Slowly, deliberately, Emily reached out, her fingers grazing his. Daniel felt the weight of that touch everywhere. He exhaled sharply, his resolve crumbling. And then, chime. A door. They jerked apart, the spell shattering as the sound of footsteps echoed through the shop. Emily straightened, her expression instantly guarded. A man's voice called out. You hear, Mark." Daniel felt his stomach drop. Emily shot him a sharp glance, panic flickering in her eyes. Without thinking, Daniel stepped back, retreating into the nearest aisle just as Mark rounded the counter. "There you are." Mark smiled, oblivious. He held up a paper bag. "Brought dinner. Thought I'd surprise you." Emily forced a smile, stepping toward him. "That's sweet." Her voice was steady, but Daniel could see the tension in her shoulders. Mark kissed her temple, his affection so casual it made Daniel's gut twist. If Mark had been a minute later, if Daniel had leaned in just a little closer. He exhaled silently, pressing a hand against the bookshelf behind him. What the hell was he doing? Emily glanced in his direction, just for a second. A fleeting look, unreadable yet full of things unsaid. Daniel clenched his jaw. He needed to leave. Because if he stayed any longer, he wasn't sure he'd be able to stop himself next time.